So if you're a bricklayer or a plasterer or a carpenter, this was a fantastic opportunity. But then there were others who had lost absolutely everything, and there were national appeals to try to provide funds to help people in their time of need. Losing your home, losing all your possessions, losing your community would have been very, very hard. And some people would never recover from it. They had obviously just endured the horrors of the plague. This is one blow after another blow. So we know for sure that some people had mental, emotional trauma. It must have really had a big physical impact as well as a mental impact. And then it happened that one poor man who clearly was mentally disturbed, for whatever reason, possibly he was under great duress, we'll never know, confessed to causing it. Pretty much everybody would have known they couldn't have caused the fire. It's one of the most terrible things, really, that he was formally accused. He was hung. And I think it was just the most horrendous thing, really, because it was almost as if, well, look, we'll blame this man, and then everything, we forget about it, and you carry on as before.
Hello and welcome to the British History Channel. My name is Philippa Lacey-Bruhl, and this is the latest of our historian interviews. Today, we are talking the Great Fire of London of 1666 with Hazel Forsyth. She is Senior Curator of the Medieval and Early Modern Collections at the Museum of London and the author of this fantastic book, Butcher, Baker, Candlestick Maker, Surviving the Great Fire of London. Now, Hazel's book was published in 2016, which marked the 350-year anniversary since the Great Fire, which devastated the City of London. And it takes readers through the horrors, the reality of the fire and its aftermath through the eyes of the people affected by it. It really is an inspired format. She takes us through the events of the fire by the trades that were working in the city at that time, how they were affected, how the people who worked in them were affected. Now, Hazel is also, this is a very impressive list, a Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Arts, a Freeman of the City of London, a Liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Goldsmiths, and a Liveryman of the Worshipful Company of Pewterers. She's worked on numerous exhibitions in this country and abroad, and as well as the book I've already showed you, has also published a book on London's lost jewels, The Cheapside Hoard. That was published in 2013, and I happen to know she's working on another one about the Cheapside Hoard at the moment, so look out for that. Now, members of my British History Patreon have been able to submit their own questions for Hazel, which I will put to her at the end of this interview. Now, you can become a patron on my Patreon, should I say, and see the extended interview at patreon.com/British History. Membership gives you lots of history lover benefits, including putting your own questions to future guests. First of all, welcome, Hazel. Thank you so much for giving me your time today to do this, because I know you're really, really busy. So first of all, welcome. And do you want to let us all know a little bit about what you're working on at the moment?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me to talk. I am very busy, and one of the reasons for that is that the Museum of London, or the London Museum as it's now known, is moving to a new site in West Smithfield, so barely 10 minutes from our current location. But moving lock, stock and barrel, a museum, is no small thing. And the buildings we're moving to were former market buildings for Smithfield Meat Market, wholesale market. So there are lots of architectural challenges in reforming buildings which were not intended to be anything other than a marketplace into a cultural centre. And so part of my job over the last 3 years now, well, a little bit longer actually, has been to work up the content of specific parts of the new galleries, and in particular a space which will house the Cheapside Hoard, which is this fabulous collection of jewellery and unset gemstones, more or less 500 pieces, ranging in date from antiquity to the early 17th century, but buried in the 17th century. So it's a real treasure trove in every sense, and that's going to be on permanent display alongside some of the historic pieces from the Goldsmiths Company collection to provide context to the wider trade of the goldsmith jeweller in the 16th and 17th centuries.
Fantastic. I mean, I want to talk to you about the Cheapside Hoard at another time, because you've written about that, obviously, as well as the Great Fire of London. But we'll have to stick to the Great Fire of London today. And do you know when is the museum due to open?
Well, good question. I sort of fudged that a little bit, but I think the date is 2025. Okay. But,
okay.
Yeah.
And does the museum remain open at its current site during that time?
No, that's a jolly good question. I'm glad you've asked that, because we actually closed to the public at the end of this year, in December this year.
Oh, okay.
And the reason for that is that we have to decant all our galleries, we have to pack everything up. And in a museum, typically, what do you have on display? It's the very tip of an iceberg. And we have lots of collections that are kept in reserve for research, for loan, so that we can refresh our displays, and primarily, obviously, for research and future scholarship. So every single item that we have has to be audited, assessed, packed, and then we have to sort of designate where it's going to go. So it's logistically a massive undertaking.
Yeah.
Which is why we need to close to the public when we do.
I imagine it might look a little bit of a mess for a while as everything comes out, gets packed up. What a packing list that is going to be as well. That's anyone who doesn't like packing for holiday, just imagine what Hazel's having to go through. Can you imagine getting to the other end and going, didn't we have a
yes, that's the need for the audit. Yeah. So every object in a museum has a unique number, and that way we can account for it. And these days we can barcode things as well. So it's all very sophisticated. We have these complicated databases, and we can work out exactly where an object is at any one time.
Would anything be going out on loan during those 2 years? You know, sometimes like the National Portrait Gallery have got their portraits sort of winging around the country at the moment.
Yes. Well, we currently have a lot of our collection out on loan. So we've lent stuff to the Victorian Albert Museum, to the British Museum. They've been on long-term loan for years. We lend abroad a lot. It's been a bit trickier with COVID. You know, we lent stuff abroad and then we couldn't get it back again. But so that will continue to some extent. But the thing is that, well, I think in truth, we don't quite know. I think there are issues because of the administration. It's quite an onerous thing to do. It's very time consuming. And because the registrars will be working on things that we're going to be having for the new museum, it's going to be very challenging if we also then start lending a lot of material at that time, at that critical time too. And we've got a lot of historic loans as well that we've had for many years. So a lot of those things that if they're not going into the new museum have to go back to the lenders. So there's a huge amount of work already. But I suspect we may be asked to lend the odd few things here and there.
Yeah. Maybe when people catch on that you're going to be closed for 2 years and they can put something on display. It's just interesting, isn't it, how you get, because you get these pop-up exhibitions places that can be ever so interesting, and it means people who potentially aren't usually able to come to London might be able to see some of your collection in the meantime. So let's get on to the reason that I wanted to speak to you today, and it's the Great Fire of London. Can we give a little bit of context there around the time in which the Great Fire of London took place? So what was it like in the city of London, summer 1666?
Well, from the evidence that we have from contemporaries, we know that London was a bustling, noisy place, very cosmopolitan, very built up, streets full of people and traffic generally. And during the course of the 17th century, the city had got bigger and bigger, and the suburbs have been sort of absorbed. But you have to imagine a city really with three distinct urban centres. So you have the city within the wall, its old medieval wall, and then to the immediate north, a sort of quaggy, marshy ground called Moorfields, and Lincoln's Inn Fields a little bit further to the west, but really broken up with these sort of irrigation channels, usually used for pasture for cattle and the odd few sheep, perhaps, although it was a little bit damp for sheep, for drying, washing, that sort of thing. The old summer house, and then the river, of course, running through, and linking the city to Westminster, which was still a separate urban space, but joined by this linear development along the Strand, Fleet Street and the Strand, and development to the north around Holborn. And then the third urban centre was Southwark, which at this stage had about 10% of the national population. So it was a pretty significant urban space, but separated by the Thames.
And what's the sort of political situation at this time? Who's on the throne? Who have we got in charge? What's the feeling like in the city?
Well, Charles II had been restored to the throne in 1660. And I think one could say that there was still a certain honeymoon flavour. And probably many people were beginning to sort of regain some sort of normality after the traumas of the English civil wars and the Restoration period, settling down to if not necessarily a new way of life, certainly a new way of thinking, with a new monarch who had different ideas and different approaches, and who was trying to learn the lessons of the past, and particularly his father, in nodding towards some kind of constitutional government. And I think there are signs that the city was not only a sort of very busy metropolitan space and by far the most populous urban space in the country, but was also the centre for luxury trade and increasingly overseas trade, which had been a feature really of Elizabeth I's reign, with the big expansion of mercantile trading companies. But I think it gave a little bit of a boost to the economy that we had. Actually, to be fair, Cromwell, who had a really quite fast-seeing foreign policy, and that was something that was developed by Charles in the early part of his reign too. He wanted to establish links, particularly with the colonies in America.
So starting to feel a bit more freedom, and trade was picking up. So it's a busy place. with ships coming in from all over the world as well.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So do you know actually how many different trades there were operating in the city around about this time?
It's very, very difficult to estimate, but we're talking about several hundred. So there were the well-established trades like weaving and goldsmithing and the grocery trade and so on. But then there were also specialist trades that were becoming more and more important. So people who made trunks. So there'd been coffer makers, but they sort of became known as trunk makers. And you have upholsterers and, you know, sort of subdivisions of specific trades. So, for example, with a coach, which was a big new thing in this period, I think there was something like 50 specific trades needed to make a coach.
And people would be trained and stick in one trade generally?
Very largely. I mean, there was a little bit of crossover, but yes, very largely. People were becoming increasingly specialised.
That's interesting. I'm trying to remember the name of what's the name of the trade where they build the barrels for
Coopers.
wine? Coopers.
Yes.
It's quite a popular still. It's quite a common, should I say, surname as
It
well.
is.
I know a few Coopers.
It is. And actually, it's one of the most skilled trades. I mean, I think if people look at a cask, they probably don't think about how complicated it is to make, but it's extraordinarily skilled. And there are very few, just a handful of coopers now who can make casks in the traditional manner. So they're very much sought after. And one of the big, I suppose, issues of this period was the need for packaging of all kinds, because commodities were being sent all over the world, brought into London from all over the world. So all kinds of specific sorts of containers were needed to protect the contents. And a barrel or cask, to be specific, a cask really, because a barrel is a particular unit, have to be made so that they're airtight and
thrown about and incredible, really. So and so this is, I mean, I'm getting the impression then of a really bustling, interesting place. So if we were walking down the street in the summer, say August of 1666, what would the feel be, the smells, the heat? I don't know. What would we be experiencing walking down the street?
I suppose it depends which street. let's take Cheapside as our case, because that was London's widest street by far, and it ran from St Paul's Cathedral all the way east to an area known as the Poultry, and then a little bit beyond that was called East Cheap, right down to the Tower. And in fact, it's still a remarkably wide street, but it was not only London's widest street, but it was its primary thoroughfare and processional route, ceremonial route for all kinds of civic and functions and pageants and the like. But the word cheap comes from the Saxon word market, so it also served as a marketplace at certain days of the week. And moreover, it was lined with luxury shops and merchants' houses, very large taverns. So it's a bit like Bond Street of its day in terms of the luxury side of the street. But also it had this real commercial heart, and would have been thronged with traffic.
Interesting. What about one of the side streets then?
Leading off of these main thoroughfares, of which there were many, Cheapside was just one, were a whole network of little alleyways and lanes, passageways. In fact, you can still find some of these today if you look hard in the city. And sometimes they end up in a dingy back passage with a sort of a cul-de-sac. But more often than not, they went into courtyard spaces. So behind the street front, typically you'd have a passage leading out into a courtyard, perhaps another doorway, and then beyond that another courtyard. So a whole warren of buildings, shops and houses jostling together, rich and poor living in close proximity. So wherever the land was available, a building was put into the space and then subdivided and let out. So you might have one room or several, depending on your income.
So they're pretty packed in. What are the planning laws like at this time then?
The planning laws were fairly haphazard, and really it was more a question of wealth and influence. If you had full title to a plot of land, you could more or less do what you wanted with it. Certainly internally, there were sort of rules and regulations about the distance between wells and cesspits, because obviously nobody wants a cesspit built up against a well. But obviously people broke the law and broke it repeatedly. And we know that because each parish is broken down into smaller administrative units called precincts. And there were sizes of nuisance where neighbours complained about each other, things like guttering, overflowing, being nuisance neighbours in all sorts of ways. So if you've got, there's one wonderful case of a man who was an upholsterer who was stuffing feathers, and the feathers got out and started wafting along the street and going up people's noses, and they all complained. And then you get constantly complaints about cesspits overflowing, not being cleared out properly, seeping into an adjoining cellar, somebody knocking through someone's party wall or trying to push their party wall into an adjoining property. Lack of light. So that was another big source of complaint, that people would pop in a little building and then, of course, next door complained and said, look, now you're either overlooking our space or you've made our space incredibly dark and dingy. So there were big corporations who owned large tracts of land and the properties on that land, and they were charged with maintaining those properties and making sure that their tenants behaved themselves. And if they didn't, they were brought to book and fined or made to redress the problem, in much the same way that planning laws apply now, that if you do something without planning consent, that your structure is pulled down or you're made to compensate or essentially just remedy the defect. So that went on all the time.
But if they're redressing it, so I always had the impression of it being really so haphazard that all this was sort of rife. But I suppose if they're addressing it, then it could mean the opposite, that actually they were keeping quite a handle on.
They were doing their best to keep a handle, but there was no overall planning structure. So it was very much down to individual landlords and their tenants, and to a degree the municipal authorities, because obviously things started to become a significant issue anywhere, then they would take measures to ensure that things were addressed. But a lot of stuff happened without recourse to the wider community, so it was at a very, very local level. And
so what's the population of London at the time that the fire broke out? Do we know?
Well, it had been impacted very severely by the plague that preceded it. So it's very difficult to be certain, but around 500,000 people. It's thought about 100,000 people that died of plague, and some people who left the city chose not to return. But when people did come back, there were also people coming from other parts of the country to fill the gaps. And so it's probably around about 500,000 people.
So 500,000 packed into pretty much the square mile, with it a little bit overflowing.
The square mile and the Westminster and Southwark. So that whole conurbation, really.
Okay. So let's talk specifically then about the fire. So how and when? Let's go right back to basics. How and when did the fire begin?
Well, the fire began in the very early hours of the morning on the 2nd of September 1666 in a baker's shop in Pudding Lane, and very quickly developed and spread. There are many possible reasons why it spread as quickly as it did, but one theory is that it had been a very long, hot, dry summer. So everything was sort of tinned dry, but also it was very windy, and the wind picked up the sparks, and those sparks ignited a line of warehouses just at the bottom of Pudding Lane, which were full of navy supplies, tar, hemp, and other highly flammable substances. And they just went off like a series of incendiary bombs, which made it very, very difficult to contain. And with the high winds, it just created its own vortex. And the streets, the narrowness of the streets funneled the flames, which increased its heat and intensity. So very, very quickly, matters got out of hand. And 4 days later, the fire had finally more or less died out. The movement of the fire is quite interesting. It took all sorts of paths, but broadly spread west and north. But because of the high winds and the fact that the sparks were blowing, you ended up with sort of pockets of fire, almost like little islands. And then whatever the flammable materials in those spaces were, either reduced or increased the volume and intensity of the fire. So many houses had cellars with flammable materials of one sort or another, and that just literally fueled the fire. And by the end of those 4 days, 3/5 of the city had been destroyed, and it caused more damage than the Blitz in the last war. So it was utterly devastating for citizens and for the country as a whole.
So this is a major trading post. It's got a concentration of people. It's near to Westminster, which is still the seat of power and government, and 3/5 of it have gone in 4 days.
Yeah.
It's really hard to kind of imagine, actually, when you know it's a familiar story, and yet it's incredible and quite difficult to sort of believe in one way. Now, so how did people react, and how did that change during the duration of the fire? Because 4 days is a long time for an emergency situation, isn't it?
It is indeed. It's really interesting because I think human nature doesn't change, and one of the things that's very apparent is that people responded to this incident in very, very different ways, partly depending on their particular circumstances, of course, but also to a degree on their temperament. So the Lord Mayor, for example, who was woken up in the early hours of the morning, was probably very cross, clearly very cross, had to get out of bed, and made the remark that a woman could piss the whole thing out, and promptly went back to bed. Now, he clearly underestimated the gravity of the situation, because fires were a regular occurrence in London, and was entirely dismissive of the whole affair until, of course, the reality of the situation became very apparent. Pepys, who was a little bit further to the east, was woken up by one of his servants, and the whole of the sky, you know what it's like, when we have a fire now, or bright lights, they always appear much more intense at night. So there was this sort of glow in the sky, and either the servant hadn't yet to go to bed, or was woken up by this sort of unusual atmospheric effect and peered out the window from the garret, and then alerted everyone in the household. And by this time, probably, the sounds were becoming ever closer, that there might have been sort of smoke filling the neighbouring streets, general noise and hubbub, as more and more people became aware of what was going on. Now, obviously, the people closest to the fire had to take emergency action to save their possessions as much as they could. But we talked earlier about Cooper, and opposite in Pudding Lane was a tiny, narrow street filled with 40-odd tradespeople of all kinds, but many of them working for the Navy as part of their sort of victualling yard. And opposite the baker's house was a cooper. Now, you cannot move large casks, huge bulks of timber, big iron hoops easily at the best of times, even assuming you can get a cart when you need one. And then a cart will block up an entire street. And so then what happens, and you end up with this log jam. And that's precisely what happened, that, people were doing their best to procure some kind of conveyance to move valuables, and particularly things like ledgers, because without having a ledger that lists your creditors and debtors and your basic stock, you're lost, really. And things like sort of property deeds and things that people would have felt that they absolutely had to take, where they could, they did. But then if they had young children or family members who were frail or infirm, their first priority would be to ensure their safety, and the material effects would have to just be forgotten in their efforts to remove their family to safety. And as the flames got worse and the streets got more and more crowded, it just became impossible for people to move around. Further afield, as the rumours spread, people who perhaps had been in other parts of London, or indeed other parts of the country, were beginning to hear about it. And then they took measures to try to get back, if their home was closer to the source of the fire, to do what they could to protect their valuables. So there are wonderful accounts of people who were working for some of the city guilds, and who were responsible for the treasures of those guilds, trying to get back to remove their ledger books and their silver and all their other valuables. But then, of course, there was the point where, do we do that, or do we protect our own home and property, or do we sacrifice our own home and property, and in the interests of the municipality and the corporation that we're associated with? So people had to make very swift decisions and courageous decisions in many cases. And then there were others who thought, it's not going to come here, it'll die out in a few hours. We don't need to move. It's a nightmare in the city. Let's just, wait it out. Fires come and go, and this will be no different. It might be a bit worse than some of the ones we've seen recently, but it won't come anywhere near here. And then, to their horror, it did, and it was too late to do anything about it. And the time that they'd lost in, trying to put their things together and move to a safer place had gone. And then they were in a desperate panic. So circumstances varied hugely.
Must have been absolutely terrifying. And you mentioned briefly earlier about the noise, or you mentioned something that made me think about the noise. I mean, it must have been just a cacophony of, because the church bells started ringing, didn't they, I think, to try and warn people. But of course, that's until the church itself had disappeared. And just people, chaos, the fire itself. Visibility, what would visibility have been like?
We don't know, but I imagine, very, very difficult, if not impossible to see in certain places. People's eyes would have been running because of the smoke. They would have had smoke inhalation. Also, we mustn't forget there were loads of animals in London too, not just in the markets, but, lots of pigs and other domestic animals being kept for food, and the horses. So everyone was reliant on horses, and the poor creatures, must have been absolutely terrified. And there are many, well, not many, but there are some examples where, the horses just ran amok and broke out of their shafts, crashed into buildings or people or the carts. So you would have had, human sounds, screams and cries, the rending sound of buildings falling, and explosions from commodities that were highly combustible and volatile, as well as the actual roar and sound of the flames themselves. So very, very disturbing. Even, as a bystander, even if you were watching from afar, the shock and horror would have been horrendous to witness.
I think, isn't the official death toll from it something really small, like 4 people? Was it? It's something.
We just don't know, because for many centuries, the parish clerks have recorded the numbers of dead in a particular parish on a weekly basis, and then those were compiled at the end of a year in a series of statistical assessments for the city as a whole. But of course, during this time, nobody's going to keep accounts, and because the population dissipated, it would be very hard to know, what happened to your neighbour, because they may have gone to another part of the country, or you may never have seen them again. So that was a massive issue, to just try and account for people, and that took a long and slow process. There must have been people who died directly or indirectly as a result of this, but clearly there were a lot of people who died of shock, or because after the immediate aftermath of the fire, they were living in temporary accommodation, and sometimes makeshift kind of hovel kind of accommodation. And I suppose if you think about Ukraine now, all these poor people being driven from their homes can take nothing but what they can carry. And you often see people holding obviously a baby, but maybe a pet, and very little else. And so the long-term effect of that trauma is profound. And we know for sure that one or two people were driven mad, and some people who had health conditions anyway, or were very old. You know, the whole thing was just sorry about that, was just too much for them. So we know for sure that some people had mental, emotional trauma as a result of this, and some people had health conditions which were probably exacerbated by the event, and then it probably shortened their life quite considerably.
You're talking there about smoke inhalation?
Well, I'm guessing that would have happened, absolutely. But also, you know, if people had heart conditions or other ailments, the whole, depending on how badly affected they were by all of this, it must have really had a big physical impact as well as a mental impact.
I suppose we'd recognise that as a post-traumatic stress disorder nowadays.
Yeah.
You wouldn't expect someone to have been in the middle of a burning city and then just be okay. You know, we would fully expect they would need support, and this is not the sort of thing that's available in 17th century London.
No, and it wouldn't have been recognised either. And I think people were not necessarily used to trauma, but they understood mortality in a way that I think we don't now. And they had obviously just endured the horrors of the plague. So, you know, in one sense, this is one blow after another blow. And some people are incredibly tough and stoic, and they just get on with it. But for others, it might just have been one blow too much. And, you know, losing your home, losing all your possessions, losing your community would have been very, very hard. And some people would never have recovered from it because they would have gone to a different part of the country entirely. They may have lost their entire source of income, all their stock, had no means of recouping their loss. And that has a massive impact on people. And it was enough in some cases to just push them to the extreme. And one man we know committed suicide. He was rescued from a pond, turned upside down. But sadly, it was too late, and he died a day or so later. And then it was said that one of the reasons for his mental breakdown, it possibly wasn't the only reason, but was the fact that he'd lost property in the fire.
It's the loss of total control of your life, isn't it? If your home, your business, all your possessions have gone. It's a loss of control, and it's really, really difficult to deal with, and not surprising that people were pushed to the very edge of what they could cope with. So what were the attitudes of people after the fire, when they'd had time to reflect and sort of getting over the emergency mode? What were people's reactions and attitudes towards what had happened?
Well, again, that's really interesting because it depended, of course, on their own circumstances. So some people saw it as an opportunity. London needed a huge workforce, particularly the building trades. So if you were a bricklayer or a plasterer or a carpenter, this was a fantastic opportunity because you were needed. You could, to some extent, negotiate a good wage, and you weren't short of work. And some people benefited financially from this quite significantly. also people working in the areas that hadn't been affected by fire obviously were a great advantage, because they could continue to supply goods and services, and could make a significant profit. But then there were others who had lost absolutely everything, and either then decided to reassess their lives, perhaps change, were forced to change career and take up any kind of work that they were able to get, or reliant upon charitable aid of some sort. So most people working in London belong to a trade or craft guild, and those guilds, as part of their charter in many cases, took very seriously their responsibility, not just to their property portfolios, but also to their members, and provided social and emotional support where they could. So they were at pains to support widows and orphans and the infirm, and build new homes for people, and make sure that they were re-established in their trade as quickly and as well as they could, and within their capacity and means to do so. But there were other people who worked on the periphery, and who weren't part of these bigger organisations, who then relied on parish support or goodwill and charity of other people. And there were national appeals to try to provide funds to help people in their time of need. So small sums of money were sent from little parishes around the country, and sometimes those communities had people from their village who they knew and who'd come to London, but in some cases presumably they didn't know anyone, but they just tried to do what they could to help.
Because remind me, how many parish churches actually were consumed by the fire? So were sort of not able to help their own parishioners then, presumably.
That is actually true, that many of the parish churches were destroyed, and I've forgotten exactly the number. I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. I was trying to remember. I think it's something around the 40-ish mark, but I might have.
It would be roughly that, I guess. But they would still, nonetheless, have had a kind of parochial concern for their people, and would have, where they could, ensured that they had the parish registers and so on. So they would probably have actively sought out people and made inquiries and tried to find out where this person had gone and where that person had gone. And then there were designated places set up that people could go to for help. And so, a bit like today in an emergency, you had these sort of tent cities that develop, and you have people in a sort of community environment with trestle tables, making lists and noting down what people need, and trying to pass on information to make sure that, if somebody's missing some family member, that they can bring them back together again. So all of that went on.
Right. That's a little bit comforting to know. There was some help, and that you talked about human nature doesn't really change right at the beginning, didn't you? And I suppose that goes as well for the want to help people who are in need. So I want to talk a little bit specifically, I suppose, because your book, which I will hold up now because I adore this book. I know you wrote it a little while ago, but the way you've set it out in all the so by trader, basically by the trades, haven't you? I thoroughly recommend it for anyone who wants to have a really good understanding of the fire. So I've picked out a few just to ask you more specifically. And one of the trades that you cover is a stationer. Now we think of stationers now like a shop where you go and buy your letters and envelope. If anyone ever buys paper to send letters
Yeah.
anymore, I don't know. Pads of paper for school, perhaps. But it got me thinking, and also the way you cover it in the book as well. So a stationer, what sort of books, documents are they creating and would have been lost in the fire? And have we got any idea how, I don't even know how you'd quantify it actually, but how much sort of I suppose important documents were lost, and what are the consequences then? You mentioned ledgers before. What are the consequences if your lease for something or your ledger or whatever it is has got destroyed in the fire?
Well, businesses rely on paper, and they always have, really. And any business needs to know, how much, what their liquidity is, and, who their clients are, and names and addresses, and, stock lists, letters with merchants if it's appropriate. It is utterly impossible to quantify how much paper there would have been in London at this time, but it would have been voluminous. And there were also books, of course, that people had, reading books. Sort of London was the centre of the printing trade. And it produced newspapers and articles and posters and prints, and they were circulated not just in the capital, but across the country and abroad. So vast amounts of paper of all kinds. And one of the risks, or not a risk, but one of the issues of being a historian is that you're only looking at a very tiny proportion of surviving evidence. And of course, you can come to conclusions based on that evidence that are not necessarily correct, because that's all we have. And in the case of many of the city companies, they often, they have their minutes which they record for their meetings, but they don't often refer to trade matters in any kind of detail unless something goes wrong and somebody falls foul of the rules, or if they decide that there needs to be some new amendment to their structure and their organisation. And that's noted. So actually trying to get a sense of who did what when and where, and what that really means is very, very difficult, if not impossible in many cases. But what we do know is that there was so much paper that even bits of paper were raining down in Windsor Great Park.
Okay, that's a fairly long distance, and this goes to show just how, I suppose, far the winds. Well, obviously, wind will carry, but it's been whipped up presumably to a high altitude and carried far away.
And for many people, the loss of that paper was extraordinarily difficult, because if you can't prove that you own a piece of land, or you can't prove that somebody owes you some money, or that you bought this piece of cloth that's now being destroyed, that makes it very, very challenging.
And not something you can prove or fight without money, because you would presumably need to go to a court or something to argue this out with somebody else who, opportunist, would make claim to your piece of land. You have no money left because everything's been destroyed.
I mean, obviously people were able to take their cases to specially convened courts called courts of fire judges, but those were mostly property cases. But even so, if you haven't got evidence to back up your claim, you've got to obtain it from some other means. So the city appointed official surveyors to go around drawing out plots of land and then trying to marry those plots with other documents that may or may not have survived, in an attempt to try to prove that, you know, somebody was entitled. But it was very, very difficult to do.
Yes, it sounds it. Now, my daughter's read your book as well, and she asked a question, rather specific. You talk about the haberdasher, so trades in cloth and presumably, and she spotted how you talk about the trends in colour were different before and after the fire, and she wondered if there was a reason, an explanation behind that. Well, explain what the difference in the trends were, and then is there an explanation? Do we know why?
Well, this is really fascinating, this whole question of colour and fashion. And I suppose what I should say as a kind of prelude to all of this is one of the reasons that I wanted to focus on individual trades was because so much has been written about the fire in general terms, but very little, nothing really about, or very little about how its impact on individual lives and communities. And so in order to get a sense of what life was like after the fire, I had to sort of go back a little bit to see what life was like immediately before it, so that one can make some sort of comparison. And this is where colour comes in. So often in documents you get, inventories in particular, reference to colour occasionally in things like bed hangings and bed furniture and upholstery. So it might be in the parlour you have curtains of a particular colour or chairs of a particular colour. And obviously people like to sweep things as they do now. And to a degree, you know, it's personal preference. So I want to have a blue bedroom and I want to have if I've got more than one bedroom, I might have them all different colours. And I might have different qualities of furnishings depending on whether it's the best room or if it's a guest room or if it's a servant's room and so on. But also it's clear that there were fashions for colour, much as there are now. And Pepys is quite fascinating because he had soft covers put on some of his chairs and then after a bit decided that they weren't the right colour and he wanted to change them to a new colour, and it was easier to do because they were soft covers and he could easily get them replaced. But so the colours that seem to have predominated in the period were green, blue and red. But occasionally you get some surprises. So, you know, I've come across bright yellow and I've even come across purple. But it does seem that there were patterns, and green seems to have been the sort of flavour of the month for quite a number of years. And then gradually sort of blues and reds start to creep in. Whether it was because the dyes that they use were becoming sort of cheaper, or whether it was just that people were getting bored with a certain colour palette and they wanted just to experiment a little bit more. It's hard to know. I think sometimes fashion is dictated by court and what's going on there. So if new textiles were coming in from France, let's say, and lots of red or blue was being worn, then people might have thought, oh, actually, I quite like a blue dress. And then if you've got a blue dress, well, actually, I think I quite like some blue curtains. So you get that sort of crossover. In other cases, the merchants who had the most money may have also been arbiters of taste because they may have been buying cloth which was already dyed abroad, or they were stipulating certain colours because their wives said, actually, you know, I quite like some red for a change. And then before you know it, everybody wants red.
trade routes are interesting. I mean, that's a whole different conversation, but it's quite fascinating, isn't it? We want something, and how far the trade routes obviously spread as well. So, but anyway, that would be a different conversation. So, we've talked before about obviously people were displaced. Now, how many do we know people and businesses were displaced? And we know some maybe went back to villages, but for the ones who had nowhere to go, what happened to them? Where did they go?
Well, there's some really fascinating documents that give us some indication. I mentioned that a lot of the municipal authorities and corporations own large tracts of land. So they had very extensive property portfolios from which they derived their income. So the guilds were one group, but there were also the hospitals, which perhaps is a little bit surprising, but that's because of their monastic endowment. So they were founded as a result of they were part of a sort of monastery originally, and then became endowed subsequently as a hospital in their own right. And over the course of time had received large sums of money from individuals who'd been treated, or somebody who wanted to patronise a particular saint and its association with the hospital. And so they had accrued over the centuries huge amounts of land and huge numbers of buildings, and used that rental income to maintain the hospital and to do the work that they did. And one of the hospitals affected was St Bartholomew's in Smithfield, and they had over 900 rental properties, many of which were destroyed. And so they had to think fast about what they did, both to recoup those losses, but also to support the people who had lost their homes and their businesses and get them back on their feet again as quickly as possible, because it was obviously in their interests as much as the individual's interest to ensure that that happened. So what they did was they took the radical decision of closing 5 of their wards and turning the space into little booths for shops. And then they converted the former cloister area into a little quadrangle of booths and shops, and basically inserted into every little corner and space they had available kiosks where tradespeople could work, and they had to pay for the space. But it did mean that they could continue to work on their trade. And so not only were they paying rent to the hospital for that space, but it also meant that they could continue to sell their wares to their customers, and hopefully in the course of time acquire enough to both resettle, either if they chose back to where they'd been or somewhere else entirely. So this went on in many, many places. So Gresham College also set up lots and lots of temporary accommodation for shops. But one of the biggest spaces that was used was the fields to the immediate north of the city, and that's where Londoners had fled. So they either went to the river and down the Thames and out. They went east or west if they could, or they went north. And very quickly, the area of Moorfields became a sort of tent city. And initially, it was probably very, very ramshackle and unpleasant for everyone. But quite quickly, the city who owned Moorfields brought in sort of rules and regulations. So the tents had to be lined along streets and worked out on a sort of grid pattern. And then the tents became sheds so that people were given the better protection over the winter months. And those sheds were also rented And some of them were 1 story high, some 2, some even 4 story high. And quickly signs started to appear on the sheds so people could see what they were selling, and, so they would continue to trade as they had been before. And some of them became sort of almost semi-permanent structures, so much so that the city had to, in the end, say, look, you've got a limited period of time here. It's time you got out. But it became from a tent city to a sort of temporary city. And then gradually people got back into permanent buildings again.
It's fascinating. I was just thinking, with people carrying on trading, those that were reliant on the warehouses that burnt pretty quickly at the beginning of the fire, where were they then relying on? Where were those ships now coming into, or where were the merchant, or these halls now being warehouses, should I say? Sorry, where were they now having to go for their materials?
Well, a lot of the key sites and wharves had been destroyed, and so where they could, they cleared the rubble so that they could bring ships up, to offload as quickly as they could. And then the areas that hadn't been burnt, they converted large buildings, former granaries, big structures, into new warehousing space. So that happened very, very quickly. And the idea really was to make sure that London, the commodities that London relied on, both imports and exports, that provision was made for storage and for trade to continue. So there's an account of one man who Pepys mentions, who was a master turner. So he made wooden items of all kinds for the Navy. And Pepys mentions him because he said that he saw him scrabbling around in the street, in the gutter, with his trays and shovels and pans, trying to get them onto a cart. Now, he was fortunate insofar as he worked for the Navy, so he had certain access to carts, and he was also right on the eastern edge of the city by the Tower of London. So in the first instance, he moved all his stock into the Tower, and then poor man died, but he had another property in Greenwich, and his wife then moved there with all the stock. And clearly this building was much smaller than the one that they previously inhabited, because the account suggests that, the hallway was jammed full of stock, and the dining room, and, so the whole house was crammed full of commodities. So that there was a bit of that going on as well, that, if people had got their goods out, then they had to kind of squeeze them into available spaces that they had, that they were also living in at the same time, until they got a shop or until they got warehousing space.
I'm fascinated by how quickly the warehouse space got found and created, in order to, presumably because they didn't want to have a break in ships coming in and out as much as possible. You didn't want to be putting people off coming in. That's really interesting. So because I was going to ask which trades got back to it the quickest. So I don't know, did just generally people who did manage to get back quickly because they were they were enabled to, in a different location? Were there particular ones that took longer to get re-established? What's your feel for that?
I don't think that's an easy, if even possible, question to answer, because again, it would depend on circumstance, and somebody might have got the majority of their things to safety, They might have had all their working tools with them, and they might have had the kind of job, say they were a tailor. So you don't have a huge quantity of working tools, and people would, if you can find a bench somewhere to work in reasonable light, and you can get enough thread, or you've managed to, preserve a lot of yarn, then people will come to you for patching up your clothes and things like that. Or if you're a cobbler, you don't need vast amounts of working tools to practice your trade. But for others, it would have been far more difficult.
What are the biggest myths about the Great Fire of London that you would like to dispel?
Well, one is that it transformed the physical appearance of London. And I'll just say a little bit about that. So it's often suggested that London looked very, very different after the fire. The buildings were different and so on. But actually, because London has had to be very pragmatic and they wanted to get up and going as soon as they could, they built on pre-existing lines. So there were new regulations that said that street frontages should be not jettied buildings that had previously been the norm, where you have a timber frame structure, the upper floors sticking out above the ones below. So there were rules about that, that they should be flat fronted facades, brick facades, even if the structure of the building was timber frame behind. But behind that facade, you could pretty much do what you wanted. There were new regulations about distance between wells and cesspits and so on, and not having structures sticking out into the streets to cause obstacles. So those were sort of new changes. But in terms of the actual internal structures of the buildings, they were the same, and they were still timber frame structures and so on. And many of those buildings that went up after the fire remained intact until the First World War. And then there was a big sort of demolition of buildings of 17th century date at that time, and indeed in the Second World War. So, and there were also large parts of London that were unaffected by the fire. So the northeastern part of the city was largely unaffected, Westminster, and of course Southwark. So the city wasn't radically different. There were no really major reconfigurations of road systems and so on. The quaysides were a little bit different, but by and large it was a pretty familiar city to the one that had preceded it. The other thing is about the number of people that have died, and it's often said, loads and loads of people died. I don't think that would have been the case, because I think had there been lots of people that died, that would have been recorded officially in some form. Even if they didn't have exact figures, they would have been able to say, well, actually, we think 100, 200 people died. But as I said earlier, I think a lot of people probably died indirectly as a result of it, but we could never ever prove that the fire was the direct cause or indirect cause. And the other thing is to do with the plague. So sometimes people say, well, we haven't had major outbreaks of plague since the Great Fire, because the primary vector, rattus rattus, or more specifically the flea of the black rat, because of the changes to buildings, because of the way sanitation improved, etc., all meant that we didn't have a major outbreak of plague after 1665. But the areas that were most affected by plague were the ones least affected by fire. And it's much, the conditions in London of of insanitary living conditions were just as bad in the 18th and 19th and early 20th century in many places than they had been in the 17th century. So that is the kind of specious argument, and I think it needs to be put to bed.
I just want to go a little bit back, actually, but it's sort of to do with myths. I want to ask, who did people blame for the fire? And the reason I ask is because we know, that it began in Thomas Farriner's bakery, but he doesn't get blamed at the time, does he? In fact, I think he's buried still within the City of London. He's buried as a sort of, he's still an upstanding member of the city by the time he dies. So clearly he wasn't blamed. So who did people blame?
Well, the city the city obviously they had a court of inquiry. They wanted to find out who had started the fire, more particularly how the fire had started. And then, of course, from how the fire starts, the question is, well, who started it? So was there a human factor in all of this? And Farriner was obviously somebody who wanted to ensure that the blame wasn't pinned on his shoulders. And it may well have been that there wasn't an obvious human cause. It could have been spontaneous combustion of the flour. It could have been a sooty chimney that hadn't been swept, and they caught the many possible reasons why a fire might have started. So the human element could have been great, but it might have been negligible or non-existent. Because whenever, sadly, there was a great disaster or something hideous happened, people are always very quick to try to pin the blame on somebody rather than something. And our relationships with France at the time were tense and difficult, and we'd been at war with them. And so very naturally, the French were kind of one community that, people sort of said, maybe it's foreigners who've done all this. And there was a sort of significant foreign community in London too. So anyone who was a little bit different or spoke with an accent would have been targeted by some sections of the population. And then, of course, Catholicism was the other group of people who were Catholics were also targeted, and some of whom were foreign, not always. And so if you have someone who's both French and a Catholic, or, then they're really, people who are dangerous and who are incendiary in every sense and liable to sort of seditious practices of one sort or another, and traitors and so on. And then it happened that one poor man who clearly was mentally disturbed, for whatever reason, possibly he was under great duress, we'll never know, confessed to causing it. But it then transpired that he was not only feeble-minded, but also was Protestant, although of French background, and really hadn't been anywhere particularly near the pudding lane at the time. But he was just regarded as a convenient scapegoat. And so I think, although I'm sure pretty much everybody would have known that he couldn't have caused the fire, it's one of the most terrible things, really, that he was formally accused. of causing it.
Was he executed for this? I can't.
Yeah, he was hung. And I think it was just the most horrendous thing, really, because it was almost as if, well, look, we'll blame this man, and then everything, we forget about it, you know, and you carry on as before. But clearly the monument that was put up after the fire mentions Catholicism and mentions, you know, this sedition and this plot against our Protestant people, you know. So it was all very deeply unpleasant, really.
So it turned political quickly then, the blame game and the propaganda afterwards as well. What was the most influential change, do you think, if any, that to prompt any kind of progress after the fire? Was there any kind of step change in what we would recognise as progress? I don't know, other than perhaps the building regulations and sanitation of the city. Is there anything else that kind of it prompted in terms of a change?
I think one of the well, there were two things. One was fire insurance. So there had been insurance of various kinds because consignments were typically insured, and shipping had been insured. But household contents and house insurance was something that developed as a result of the fire in a really big way at the end of the 17th century. And alongside that, provisions for fire protection. So there had always been measures that the local communities had to protect their neighbourhood, and most parishes had fire buckets in the local church, fire ladders and hooks and other apparatus that they might need for emergency use. But this became much more formalised and eventually became the fire brigades that we know about. So some of the authorities I mentioned, St Bartholomew's Hospital, they had fire engine, but it was damaged in the fire itself, and then new fire engines with better pumping systems were developed, and better hoses to deal with the water pressure, because one of the big problems was actually getting access to water, because the conduits were either running dry or being punctured as a result of the fire. And so water was sort of running everywhere. And then if you need to target water at a particular fire, then you haven't got the pressure that you need to do it. So there was a big drive to improve firefighting technologies and apparatus in the latter part of the 17th century.
Fascinating, thank you. So before we end this main part of the chat, we're going to move on to questions that my patrons on the British History Patreon have put forward. Let's take this opportunity to tell people where they can find you, your work, your books, and tell them a little bit more about you and where they can see your work. Well,
I work as a curator at the Museum of London, and my sort of primary work is, well, I suppose it's hard to describe it. I have to cover everything from the end of the Romans, 410, right through to the beginning of the Georgian period, so 1714. But I'm really, it's huge, but that's because the previous senior curator of the medieval collection retired and wasn't replaced. I'm not a medievalist. I really specialise in the 16th and 17th century. But within that, I have a particular interest in jewellery and metalworking. So I've written books on our pewter collection, and which we have a fabulous collection. including a group of material ranging in date from the 12th century to 1800, of small objects that were made both for adults and for children, as playthings or trifles and trinkets. And my main focus at the moment is a new book on the Cheapside Hoards. So I've written one book or two on it, but one to coincide with an exhibition I did a few years ago. The one I'm doing now hopefully will be a sort of definitive catalogue. So it's very, very detailed about each piece in the hoard, how it's made, put together, all its material properties.
Wow. Did you say there's 700?
About 500 objects.
500 objects, okay.
Yeah. So I've written over 90,000 words on about 45 objects so far. And I've been trying to fit it in and around my other curatorial work, because obviously that takes precedence. So
the books you've already got out, though, are they available via the Museum of London and places like Amazon?
Yes, and Waterstones and, you know, all the big kind of bookshops, and yeah. So, and
if people want to come and see the museum, so Museum of London as it currently is until the end of 2022.
Yes. And
then we're going to have to manage for a couple of years without you until your new site opens at Smithfield in 2025.
That's right. And I don't have a definite date in 25.
But we will keep people posted. I'm really interested to see, because I mean, I've been down to that site before, just for various different reasons, and seen it as a market. So I'm really intrigued what it's going to look like.
So am I. Yeah. I mean, even though you work on something, you know, you never quite know what it's going to be like when it's finally done. So it'd be very interesting to see.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for answering all those questions.
You're very welcome.